Hey everyone, we're going to take a look at getting started with Couchbase Server in a Java application. So a few things to note before we proceed, because it will be a requirement, is you will need Couchbase Server 4.0 or higher installed. I will be using 4.5.1 in particular, but anything 4.0 or higher should be fine. Another thing to note is you will need the JDK installed. So I'm using JDK 8, but 8 or 9, it should work fine. And likewise, I will also be using Gradle. So Gradle will need to be installed as well. So if you're not familiar, Gradle is an alternative to Maven. And I actually find it a little easier in a lot of cases. But this is personal preference. Maven will work fine as well. But this tutorial will use Gradle in particular. So the first thing we want to do is let's go ahead and create a new project on our desktop. We can go ahead and say make directory, and let's call it my project. And then let's navigate into that project, and we're going to initialize a new Gradle project from this directory. So we're going to say Gradle init, and we're going to say -- type, and then the type is going to be Java library. So this is taken from the Gradle documentation. All right, so it went to get ahead and set up all the boilerplate for us, which I'm going to now open in my editor of choice. You could be using IntelliJ or whatever it may be. I'm actually just going to use more of a text editor. I'm going to be using Atom, so I'm going to open this. All right, so let me close out of all of these tabs. And you'll notice that it set up all of our project structure for us. We're going to be spending all of our time in the build.gradle file, as well as the main Java, and it's going to be the library.java file, but let's go ahead and rename that because library doesn't really make sense to what our project is going to be. So I'm going to click rename, and I'm actually going to call this Couchbase project. And inside of the file, I'm going to change the class name. This class name is going to be also Couchbase project. And I'm going to wipe out this method, and we're just going to make it a main function. So public static void main, and we're going to say string args. So just the fundamental Java stuff that everyone knows and loves. So when we run our Gradle project, we want it to run this main function when we try to run, but by default it won't do this. So go into build.gradle, and we need to add a few lines to make this a success. So first of all, underneath the apply plugin Java, we also want to say apply plugin, and this one will be application. And underneath it, we can say main class name equals Couchbase project. So the main class name being what we had just defined, Couchbase project.java. So now when we say Gradle run, it's going to run that function. So the next thing we want to do is we need to include the Couchbase Java SDK in our project. So this will be a dependency. So under the dependencies section, we're going to say compile. We're going to say com.couchbase.client : Java-client : and then the version number. The version we'll be using here is 2.3.4. And we're going to hit save. So up until now, let's go ahead and make sure that everything compiles. So going back into the terminal, let's go ahead and say Gradle run. So it just downloaded all of the dependencies being what we have in the dependencies section, and it really ran our project. So of course there was nothing to run inside of that main function, but at least we know it didn't fail. So we can actually proceed on. But before we do, let's go ahead and take a second to configure our Couchbase server bucket. So that way we can use it in this application, because we're going to be doing several different ways to solve a problem in this example. So open up your Couchbase dashboard. And what we want is we really want to create a bucket. I'm calling my bucket example. You can use default, you can use whatever you want as your bucket. But what's really most important here is we need to create an index for that bucket that we plan to use. In my example, I'm going to be using example as my bucket. But as you can see, there is no index for that bucket. So going into the query tab, if you're using Couchbase 4.5 or higher, go ahead and enter this query. So we're going to say create primary index on example using GSI. And we're going to click execute. So it went ahead and it created an index for us. Now I mentioned 4.5. If you're not using 4.5 and you don't have a query tab, you can actually use the Couchbase command line tool and create the index through the command line tool, which does ship with Couchbase Server. But moving away from that, now we can focus more on our code again. So going into Couchbase project.java, let's go ahead and add some imports to our dependencies. And if you're using an IDE, it'll do this for you, but of course I'm not. But there isn't that many, so let's do it real quick. All right, so I went ahead and I included all of the dependencies. We're going to be, of course, like I said, querying multiple ways. So we're going to see multiple ways to solve the problem here. But we're really going to be using CRUD operations and as well as nickel queries, which are SQL queries for JSON for Couchbase only. So with our dependencies imported into our class, let's go ahead and worry about now establishing a connection to our Couchbase server. So we can say cluster equals Couchbase cluster dot create, and we're going to provide it the host on one of the nodes of that cluster. So of course I only have one node in my cluster, but if you have a multiple node cluster, go ahead and provide one node and hit save. With the connection established to your cluster, let's go ahead and open up a particular bucket. And in this case, my bucket is called example, and it has no password on it. With the bucket open, now we can worry about creating and querying for documents. As of right now, we have no documents in our bucket. So let's go ahead and create one, and we're going to see two different ways to do this. So let's go ahead and say JSON object person equals JSON object dot create. And let's go ahead and populate this JSON object. This is what we're going to save into Couchbase, which is a document database, and you use JSON in it. So we're going to say person.put. Let's go ahead and say first name, and that'll be Nick. We're going to say person.put last name. That'll be Raboy. We're going to go ahead and now make things a little more complex because we don't want just a flat JSON object. We're going to add an array of objects now. So let's go ahead and say JSON array. Let's call this social media. So this is going to be an array of social media objects, just to give it a little more complexity. Equals JSON array dot create. And let's go ahead and add a few in it. And feel free to clean up the code a little bit better than I am. I'm just going to kind of mash it in there to try to keep everything collected, but definitely format your code how you see fit. So let's say social media dot add. So we're adding a new item to this array. This item is going to be a JSON object. Create it, and we're going to add a few properties to it. So we're going to say put, and we're going to say, let's say this is a title, and let's say this is for Twitter. We're also going to put, and let's give it a link. So a link value that goes with the title. And this link value is going to be my Twitter address. All right, so that's one down. Let's go ahead and add another one. So I'm going to copy that line. This time it's going to be my GitHub, and the link is going to be my GitHub address. And I'm going to hit save. So with two items added to this array, now let's go ahead and add this array to the object. So we're going to say person.put social media, and we're going to add this object. And now it's added. So the array is now part of this JSON object. At which point now we can actually save it. So we're going to say JSON document equals JSON document dot create. So we have our JSON object, which is the data of our Couchbase document, but we need to create the entire document itself. So that consists of a key and a value, the value being the JSON data. So the key, let's go ahead and name this key nraboy because it's my document. And for the value, let's go ahead and put person. So the JSON document's created, but it's not saved to Couchbase yet. So what we want to do is we want to say bucket.upsert document. And I'm saying upsert because we're going to run this a few times. And upsert will actually, if the key does not exist, so if nraboy does not exist, it'll create it. But if it does exist, it'll replace the entire document, which is what we want. So with the document created, let's go ahead and query for that document. And then we'll run it and see where we stand so far. So let's say system.out.println bucket.get. We're going to get it by its ID. And we're going to only get the content because a lot of other stuff comes back with that data. But we only want the content, not the meta information. And we're going to save it. So at this point, we can actually try to run it and see where we stand. So going back to your terminal, let's clear it. And let's say Gradle run. So it looks like we're experiencing some kind of timeout, trying to establish a connection to our bucket. I am using Couchbase Server on a different machine. And you know what? This other machine could be having issues, so maybe we want to extend the timeout just to be sure. So let's go ahead and add a few more things. So we're going to say, we're going to import the following. Import com.couchbase client Java in env for environment, and then asterisk. And what we can do is before we actually create our connection to the cluster, let's go ahead and create a Couchbase environment. So we're going to say Couchbase environment env equals default Couchbase environment dot builder. And inside of it, we can say connect. Oops. Let's add that period on the next line. Connect timeout, and let's go ahead and give it a large millisecond value. Let's say 10,000 milliseconds, so 10 seconds. The default should be 5 seconds. So let's go ahead and add a timeout, and let's say build. We're also going to now, inside of our Couchbase cluster.create, we're going to slip env in there, and let's go ahead and try it again and see if it works this time. So I have a typo. Let's go ahead and fix the typo. I'm missing an E in there. Connect timeout. Let's try it again. So it appears to work this time. Yeah, so there was a timeout issue. Generally in a production environment you won't have this issue, but this is all being done locally on my setup. So it's all right. It's not a big deal. So what it did is it did return some data. It returned hopefully exactly what I inserted, so we can actually get a better idea out of these logs if I go into Couchbase Server and I click on the example data bucket. So inside of the example bucket, I have my key being nraboy, and I have this data that we inserted. So of course we've got flat data in here, first name and last name, but we also have this array of social media, which is an array of objects. So this is what we returned. So we upserted that document, and then we obtained that document by the same key. So there are other ways to do this, and so now let's go ahead and explore another way. So I'll leave that in there. We're just going to add new code now. Let's go ahead and create what's called a nickel query. So this nickel query will actually upsert for us in the same kind of fashion that we did with this upsert CRUD operation. So let's go ahead and say bucket.query. And let's go ahead and say N1QL query dot parameterize, and let's go ahead and provide it a simple query. So let's go ahead and say upsert into example key value values, and now we can define what we want to insert. So this is just like SQL but with JSON. So we can say the following. We're going to be using parameterized query to prevent any kind of injection attack. So ID, this is named parameters. So that's going to be our key. And then our value is going to be first name. And the next parameter is going to be first name. We're going to have last name. and the next parameter is going to be last name. We're not going to worry about arrays in this case, but you could absolutely do that. But this is just a simple example to show you how to do an upsert with nickel. So we do have this this query constructed now. The next thing that we can do is we can define those parameters, because as of right now we don't have those parameters ID, first name, last name defined. So we can do the following. Say JSON object dot create dot put, and like I said, you can clean up your code more than I have, but we're going to say put ID, and that's going to be in this case, let's say mRaboy, so this is going to be a different person. We're going to say put first name, and the value for first name is going to be Maria, and the value for last name, let's get this in here, it's going to be also Raboy, so a different person this time. And what we can do is we can now add a semicolon here, and that's our query, instead of doing all of this up here with creating JSON data. So now when it comes to querying that data that we just inserted, so let's do the following. Let's say N1QL query result equals bucket.query. And we're going to do it in a similar fashion to what we just did. We're going to say N1QL query dot parameterized. We're going to say select example dot star from example where, and we're not actually storing the ID in the document itself, so this is where the meta information that I mentioned earlier comes into play. So we're going to say meta.id equals $ID. So this is going to be our parameter. So we'll do comma, and now let's go ahead and define those parameters, being of course only one. So JSON object dot create dot put ID mRaboy. And we already have a semicolon there. There's something to note about doing select queries right after write queries. So by default, Couchbase is asynchronous. So when you insert data, the indexes are asynchronously updated. So what this means is when you insert data, it may not be readily available in your index for querying. So if I were to leave this as is right now, I probably won't get any results in my query, for the nickel query at least. So what we want to do is we want to say let's wait for the index to update for this particular query. So it really depends on what you want to do. So if you're just trying to write a lot of data and not do a whole lot of reads, well, you probably don't want to wait. You probably want to let it go as fast as it possibly can, and say we don't want to wait for the index to be refreshed. So you really have to step back and figure out what you want to do. But let's go ahead and do the following now. So we're going to say the following. We're going to say N1QL params dot build dot consistency. We're going to say scan consistency. Should be spelled correctly. Request underscore plus, and we're going to hit save. All right, so let's go ahead and go back to our terminal here, and we're going to clear it, and let's see where we stand now. So I'm going to run, and it didn't return any results this time. So let's well, it returned one result, the first one. Let's see why maybe it didn't return the second one. Let's first make sure it was actually saved. So we'll go to documents. It was saved. So let's go back into our code and have a look here. Oh, it didn't do anything. So I'm looking at this, and it didn't do anything because we're not actually printing out the results. We obtained the result, but we're not printing it. So let's go ahead and print those out. So we're going to say for. We're going to get many results probably from this query, although even though we only defined one ID, let's say N1QL query row result. So we're looping through all of the possible results, and we're going to say system.out.println and row. So now it should work this time. All right, so it did work. So it printed out one person through a nickel query, and it printed out another person through our CRUD operation, so our key value operation. So you just saw how to quickly get set up with Couchbase Server in a Java application using the Couchbase Server Java SDK. Just a recap here. Of course, we did a lot of Gradle bootstrapping first, but you can use Maven. You could use something else if you want. Doesn't matter. But we established a connection to our server. In our scenario, we had to add a timeout. For production, go ahead and leave that out and see if it works without that. Otherwise, you may have to do some tweaking. We opened up a bucket called example, which had a primary index on it. And we saw how to create data 2 different ways and query for that data 2 different ways. And this is complex data. It wasn't simple data that you'd find in a relational database. This is complex JSON data.